Mohammed is the Chief of Communications at the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor. Appreciate you coming on, Mohammed, especially we've had to jump in live to you there, so you probably weren't expecting us quite yet. But we've heard about attacks by Israel on Nusrat refugee camp, upon schools that are being used as shelters. These are makeshift shelters. So I don't know what it's like to be there, what a shelter looks like there, but presumably it is somewhere that people have gone because they're in need of a place to sleep, probably needing food, some other kinds of help. So in theory, that sounds to me like the people who are actually being killed in some of these attacks are among the very most vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, Israel has been telling the population in Gaza, you're not safe by staying in your homes. You're not safe there. Seek refuge, seek a shelter. So naturally and intuitively, people would either go to hospitals or schools as sacred, neutral institutions that they can hide in, especially if it's a United Nations facility. And that's precisely when Israel started to bomb these schools and hospitals systematically and methodically and surgically. So make no doubt about it, the schools themselves, the people inside it are the target. Each one of these schools houses hundreds, if not thousands of people that are forced to share about 10 toilets altogether, if not less. They are in a very miserable situation. The least airstrike or shelling of that school is bound to result a huge amount of casualties. But Israel, by this, is trying to drive two messages. Number one is that there's nothing safe in Gaza. That's a message that they've been very clearly, shamelessly, adamantly trying to make to the Palestinian population to exhaust them in this very long process of extermination and attrition, that there's nothing safe in order to terrorize, punish, humiliate, intimidate the population. So if the war was to end tomorrow, every single person in Gaza would consider escaping and leaving and running away. The other thing is to make sure that nothing is left in Gaza standing that can sustain organized human existence if the war stops for many years to come, if not for decades. You have United Nations estimations that would say it would take us about 10 to 20 years to only clear the rubble in Gaza. By now, Israel has bombed Gaza's hospitals, schools, judiciary, police stations, private businesses, factories, shops, homes. Nothing is basically left there to sustain any human life if the war was to end immediately. That is something that even Western leaders share this assessment. So I was recently at a meeting with a top European Union leader who showed us basically satellite footage of Gaza that the EU has been gathering and said, look, Israel is making sure Gaza will be unlivable, uninhabitable if the war was to stop today, so that people would have to leave. They know this. The problem is that despite their intimate knowledge of this, they're not willing to do anything about it. So the same EU official said that when the German foreign minister visited Israel about 8 times since October 7th, every time the only message she delivers to the Israeli prime minister and government is, continue the killing, just please kill fewer people so that it doesn't look spectacular, it doesn't generate a lot of backlash. Keep the death count below 100 people per day. Israel has been willing to oblige to sort of spread the killing and destruction across time so that it's not insane. But even then, 100 people per day is an extraordinary figure by any estimate. And if you remember, up until recently, if Israel did as much as scratch a United Nations facility in Gaza, whether in a targeted airstrike or by accident, Israel would go out of its way to whitewash, deny, apologize. In 2010, they paid UNRWA about 10.5 million in damages in compensation for the damage to its schools and headquarters. The White House, the US, would come out and say that any targeting of United Nations facilities in Gaza is, quote, totally unacceptable, totally indefensible. You are at a situation now where the US is not only completely silent, but they actively provide the bombs that Israel uses to bomb these schools and even the United Nations UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza, and then brag about it publicly, say, yes, we flattened the UNRWA headquarters, we destroyed these scores of schools.
Mohammed, can I just briefly interrupt you? Although, please, could you stay on the line? I really want to speak to you further. The only reason I say so is because we've managed to re-establish the connection with our correspondent who is in Gaza, and I would like to put some of the points that you just mentioned to him. So hopefully you can hear me now, Ashraf. Ashraf Shannon is our correspondent there in Khan Yunis. And I would like to actually just put to you a point that was made by our guest there from a human rights monitor organisation, that he says that Israel's plan here is to make Gaza simply uninhabitable, so that if this conflict was to, let's say it stopped right now, that actually it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for the people there to carry on living. How would you assess the situation? Let's say the conflict stopped. How hard would it be for people to stay there and continue or try to build any kind of life or future there?
Well, Neil, it'll be a miracle if people manage to create any form of life if this war comes to an end, because Israeli attacks since day one of the war, they were systematic against the infrastructure, the destruction of buildings, roads, water desalination plants, electricity plants, sewage treatment plants. Everything you can imagine was destroyed by the Israeli attacks since day one of the war, in addition to the killing and maiming of tens of thousands of people. So suppose tomorrow the war ends, there is nothing for any one of us here to go to, literally.
Ashraf, great to speak to you. The latest there from Khan Yunis in Gaza. Ashraf Shannon is our correspondent. Let's go back to Mohammed Shehada, who is in Denmark. He's Chief of Communications for the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor Organisation. Thanks for hanging on there for us, Mohammed. Because one of the latest attacks by Israel was on a shelter that was in a school, and obviously children are getting no schooling, it's just being used as a safe place at the moment. But when you talk about children not getting schooling for at least a year, and the death and destruction that they have seen, I would even imagine they might associate schools now as places of death, because of many of them, because of what they have seen. What kind of hope do you think they have for the future now, based on what they've been through?
Yes, absolutely. That's precisely the message that Israel has been trying to drive to the entire population in Gaza, for the children or their parents or the elderly, is that basically there is nothing safe. There's no chance of you continuing to be alive. You can die at any moment. If yesterday I saw footage from UNICEF that they published an interview with a child. He was sitting in a chair smiling happily. As soon as he heard an Israeli airplane, he started to run and panic and shed tears and try to look for his mom. The message is there to sort of wear people down, to destroy them psychologically, mentally, over a long period of time, so that they would not be willing to stay in Gaza anymore if the war stops, so that more and more of them would seek to leave. The situation for children is especially dire, not only because of the death and destruction and literally seeing members of their families being hacked into pieces by Israeli airstrikes, but it's also because of the starvation, the deliberate denial of food and water to children. I have a colleague who gave birth about a month before the war on Gaza started. At some point, she wrote me a message in which she said, quote, "Mohammed, we don't have any drinking water. We barely have salty water. I cannot breastfeed anymore." And she was then asking, not being emotive or polemic, she was asking for practical advice. She said, "How do I stay sane when my child starves to death? How do I not lose my mind and go insane?" That's literally the situation you have people at the moment. The good thing out of this is that for children, their trauma tends to be more manageable, more treatable than adults. It's easy to engage them in certain activities to sort of release the pressure that they've been put under for a very long time. The point that you made is that Israel has destroyed any institution that would be capable of doing such support activities to children. Basically, any schools, any infrastructure that would be there on the day after to allow kids to go back to a normal life and address their trauma is non-existent anymore. About 3/4 of UNRWA schools have been damaged or destroyed. And over the last 10 days alone, you had Israel destroying 8 schools in 10 days, 6 of which were UN facilities. So this level of insanity, again, it goes into the charge that is pressed against Israel at the ICJ of genocide, or the International Criminal Court, the charge of extermination. This is a very deliberate, clear, blatant strategy to wear Palestinians down, to destroy a group in whole or in part, and create conditions that would bring about the destruction of the group in the long term.
Mohammed, appreciate you coming on to give us your perspective on this. Mohammed Shehada is my guest. He's the Chief of Communications at the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor Organisation.